and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Movies of 2017. This video is the annual video I do where I count down my top 10 favorite movies of the year. So I haven't seen too many movies this year, just over 25, and unlike last year I didn't go to an international film festival, and most of the movies I saw this year were common blockbusters, so this list will be a bit less pretentious than last year's list. And typically I try to make an effort to see a lot of Oscar baity movies that everyone is buzzing about before making a list like this, but this year I didn't really have the time to do that, so I had to make do with what I've already seen. So before I get into my favorite movies, I want to start with a few awards. First one I want to get into is for Worst Movie of the Year, which is something I do every year. I don't see enough bad movies to make a list, as I try to avoid seeing movies that suck, go figure. This year I did such a good job at it, I nearly went ahead and forgoed doing this award this year. But I do think there is a movie that would qualify, although bear in mind, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad, and I'm sure there were plenty worse out there that I didn't see, thank God. But this was the worst one that I did see, which I know this pick may actually ruffle some feathers because I have seen a lot of love for this movie, including appearing on a few end of the year top 10 lists. But if I'm being honest, I have to say the worst movie that I saw this year was John Wick Chapter 2. I was never that huge of a fan of the first John Wick, although I liked it well enough, but I didn't think it was anywhere near as the masterpiece many were lauding it to be. With Chapter 2, however, I was very displeased and thought it was just a bad movie with nothing more to it than fancy action sequences, which frankly aren't enough to do it for me. I need a good constructed plot and well-told character stories, but the plot here is a bit ridiculous and no character stories existed. It doubled down in this fantasy-style assassin's world, which was cool and all, but where they took it just was not interesting, and I found myself being bored throughout most of the movie, and I was really getting frustrated with certain characters acting the way that they did when it made no sense for them to do so. And I don't want to get too much into spoilers, but the most frustrating thing to me was that John Wick should have done what he did at the end of the movie at the beginning of the movie and saved himself a lot of trouble. Everyone knows it. It made this whole affair seem like a giant waste of time. So all in all, I did not enjoy this movie at all. So next award I want to get into is most overrated movie of the year, which I have mentioned this before in previous videos, and I think it's relevant here. I've seen Split put up on many end of the year top 10 lists as well, and I must admit I've never been a fan of M. Night Shyamalan, not Unbreakable, not even The Sixth Sense. I never cared for him, so perhaps that colors my opinion on this film. And I will say I agree with fans of this film that James McAvoy gave an outstanding performance, which is why this isn't an altogether bad film, and the film did have a lot of potential in its first half to be a very effective psychological thriller, but unfortunately all that potential was thrown away by the film's third act. And I'm not just talking about one specific thing, but the whole last 30 minutes of the film delved deep into cheesy horror cliche land, with one ridiculous tired cliche after another. I'm sad to say I felt this absolutely ruined any goodwill that the film had built up in its first half, and I'm sorry, having unexpected cameo at the end does not at all make up for any of this, so in my opinion, a very overrated film. So the final award I want to hand out is for the movie that isn't as bad as everyone says it was. Perhaps the opposite of what I was just talking about, but for this award I want to give it to Ghost in the Shell, which wasn't nearly as bad as many claimed it to be. Don't get me wrong, this film was by no means great and wasn't even close to being considered for my top 10 list, but it's not terrible either. It's just fine. It's fine. It's the kind of movie you watch on an airplane or when you're home sick in bed. It's the kind of movie that you need if you need something to spend your time on and you have nothing better to do, but you've seen all the good movies, you can pop this one in without feeling that you wasted your time on crap. Nothing about it stands out as particularly good, but nothing stands out as particularly bad either. It's fine. It's fine. So, finally, let me get into my favorite movies of 2017. But before I get into my top 10, let me start with a few honorable mentions that didn't quite make my top 10 list that I still really wanted to recognize. First honorable mention is for It. I'm not typically into horror films, but It stood out as a particularly effective, creepy horror film as it fully developed its cast and characters who you grew to care about, and they weren't just throwaway monster fodder, which made the horror scenes that much scarier because you were invested in the characters' well-being. Next honorable mention is Detroit, a powerful drama that tells the story of police abuse during the 1960s riots in Detroit, and it does an amazing job at humanizing all of the characters in the film, even the antagonists, and it really puts you in the mindset of the victims, as it holds you captive in a highly intense suspense thriller that has you feeling uneasy throughout. However, the film's pacing wasn't the best, which is perhaps why it didn't quite make my top 10, but still a powerful movie. And my final honorable mention is Get Out. As I mentioned, I'm not a fan of horror, and so this film didn't look particularly appealing to me, but I've been hearing about how great this movie is all year, so I finally decided to check it out, and I was frankly surprised at how much I liked it. It was a beautifully crafted horror film that wasn't, the typical cheap jump scare movie, but instead relied on a series of effectively eerie and creepy scenes, which gives the viewer a sense of uneasiness throughout the entire film, which is the type of horror movie I personally prefer. However, the film does delve deep into horror cliche land in its third act, but still, that doesn't undermine the relevant social themes on race relations and the effective creepy feeling of the movie. So finally, we'll get to my top 10 favorite movies of 2017, starting with my number 10, Wonder Woman. This was a very well told story that did an amazing job of fleshing out its two main protagonists, who were performed really well by Gal Gadot and Chris Pine, who had some amazing chemistry. And it was an interesting twist that to the typical male-centric Hollywood film, where Chris Pine, for the most part, played the part of the damsel in distress, and Wonder Woman of the knight in shining armor. And it was these interesting character interactions that held this film together throughout. It's an action-adventure story which was really engaging in its own right. However, the film did suffer from an over-the-top, cheesy, cliche third act that was too much like every typical comic book movie, which is why I don't think that this is the masterpiece that some critics are claiming it to be. But on the other hand, I don't think it was bad enough to ruin the entire film, as some apparently thought it was. As overall, I still found it a very unique and engaging comic book film. Next is my number 9, which is The Disaster Artist. Oh, hi, Mark. So this was a pretty unique biopic that explored the making of the cult film The Room, known as being one of the worst movies ever made, but it gained a following in that regard as being a fun movie to watch and make fun of. And I'm typically not into those so bad they're good movies, but it was fascinating to see the story of how this movie got made, and it was a surprisingly inspirational story of those trying to break into Hollywood and continuing to fail, and in the end finding their own way. Having been involved in low-budget filmmaking myself, I identified with this film probably more than I'd care to admit, and overall was touched on a personal level by this film, which was carried by its charismatic, larger-than-life character of Tommy Wiseau, played wonderfully by James Franco. It was a very entertaining film to watch. Coming in at number 8 is Logan. This is not at all your typical comic book movie. Instead, comes off as a dark indie film about a middle-aged man dealing with a senior suffering from Alzheimer's and discovering his long-lost daughter. The fact that it gives a comic book slant to this only makes it that much more intriguing. And add to that, it throws in a country western road trip adventure feel to it, which only enriches the story. Many talk about how Patrick Stewart should be nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, and I could not agree more. This was one of his best performances ever, and seeing how many amazing performances he has given on just the Star Trek The Next Generation alone, this is a very bold statement, especially coming from me. In fact, when I think about how amazingly emotionally powerful and well acted many of the scenes with Patrick Stewart and young Laura are, I wonder why I don't have this movie ranked much higher. But then I remember the third act, which frankly taints the almost perfect film with a lot of cliche comic book movie tropes and over-the-top action sequences and just a bunch of throwaway mutant children that frankly I feel belongs more in a film like X-Men Origins Wolverine or X-Men 3 The Last Stand than it did in an emotional masterpiece like this one. So I must admit that it did taint my opinion on this film somewhat, but still, considering how amazingly wonderful the first two-thirds of this film plays out, it's still one of my favorite movies of the year. Next, we'll get into my number 7, which is Spider-Man Homecoming. To be honest, I've never been a fan of any Spider-Man movie, so it's not so much of a bold statement for me to say that this was my favorite Spider-Man movie, but perhaps more of a bold statement to say this is one of my favorite Marvel movies, as it foregoes many of the over-the-top comic book action set pieces that hold a lot of these comic book movies back, including several I talked about already in this video alone, in favor of more low-key character-based storylines that is much more engaging on a personal level. I always remember something I heard in a script writing class, that if the stakes of a particular movie are always as high as they are to the main characters, and the more you identify and care about the main characters, the higher the stakes for the audience will be. You don't always have to put Earth in danger from an invading alien force with a blue sky beam. And I love how the story is very low-key and the main villain is just a common arms dealer, but it's the way the villain is humanized and you can identify him that makes this movie so great, as those are the best kinds of villains. Oh, and not to mention how the light-hearted comedic feel of the film blends perfectly into its engaging plot was very impressive. So coming in at number 6 is Wind River. This was a very powerful film, which the more I thought about it, the more it affected me. Many are talking about how this was the third film written by Taylor Sheridan recently, who also directed this film, who previously wrote Hell or High Water and Sicarios, and many also point out that they didn't feel this film was quite as good as those other two, but still a great addition. However, let me say definitively that I felt this was by far the best out of the three, although this may have something to do with the fact that I didn't even like Sicarios, but I won't get into that here. Wind River at first came off to me as a stereotypical murder mystery, almost a 90s style murder mystery, which tend to come off as pretty dark and bleak. But there are many layers to peel off here that make this movie unique, none the least being amazing performances, most of all by Jeremy Renner, who is at his best, but also some powerfully written dialogue that really enhance the story overall, and I'm a huge fan of well-written dialogue. Add to that some very powerful social commentary on how Native Americans are tossed aside and mistreated in modern-day America, which underline the entire film in very powerful ways, making this a very thought-provoking and meaningful watch. So we come to my top 5 of 2017, starting with my number 5, The Big Sick. So now and then there'll be a movie that everyone is raving about but doesn't look particularly appealing to me, but I'll give it a shot anyway because so many people love it, and 9 times out of 10 my expectations are confirmed and the movie isn't that great. However, every once in a while the movie will completely blow me away and be as amazing as everyone's making it out to be when I didn't think it would be that good, and that's what happened with The Big Sick. If there's a genre that I may like even less than horror, it's romantic comedy. And so I was more surprised than anyone to see a romantic comedy that I thought was absolutely brilliant. This tells a very emotionally engaging story of a young comedian who falls in love only to have that love rejected by his parents for not belonging to the correct culture, and add to that she becomes seriously ill, forcing him to bond with her parents, and the emotional journey that he goes through was so well executed Add to that, this film really delivers on the comedic side, as this features some of the funniest jokes I've seen all years. It had me laughing like crazy at times, and yet this comedy blended so well with the dramatic through story. I was simply amazed, making this a truly exceptional film of 2017. So next, let's get to my number 4, which is Thor Ragnarok. Now, I'm just going to come right out and say this. This is my new favorite MCU movie ever, beating out Captain America Winter Soldier. I was completely blown away by this film, and yes, I think this was a much more fun thrill ride than the Guardians of the Galaxy. There, I said it. I think that film's overrated anyway. But anyway, perhaps I was more into this film already being aware of Taika Waititi, who is already well known and celebrated here in New Zealand, whose short films I studied at school. I mean, in America, he's just another indie director, but here he's celebrated as a national treasure whose films top the New Zealand box office, and I absolutely love his humor in his films like Eagle vs. Shark, Hunt for the Wilder People, and What We Do in the Shadows. That film was filmed in the city I live in, and I even know some people who were in it and worked behind the scenes on that film. So it's great finally seeing him get a shot at the big budget Hollywood blockbuster. In my opinion, this is his best work yet. Not only did he keep his signature humor, and in fact, in my opinion, elevate his humor to new heights, but also managed to tell an engaging, well-constructed action movie thrill ride that I felt really elevated the entire MCU. The cinematography in this film was simply amazing. Many of the shots were some of the most beautiful shots I've seen in any film, and it also contained some of the best action sequences cut to music that I've ever seen. Although it is fair to say I didn't like any of the earlier Thor movies, so I didn't mind that this one completely disregarded characters and storylines from the previous films, which some fans complained about, and fair enough. But frankly, I never liked them anyway, so I was actually glad that they got rid of them. And I also disagree with a lot of common complaints about the film, that it was too much of a comedy and it didn't focus enough on the dramatic moments, or that it was too much of a Taika Waititi film and not enough of a Marvel film. I completely disagree and thought this was not just a typical Taika Waititi film, as it had some amazing elements of action and drama more true to the MCU, and I thought the comedy was not overwhelming and that the dramatic moments still really shined through. So all in all, I will stand by my statement that this is the best Marvel movie ever made, and perhaps one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. So next, let me get to my number 3, Star Wars The Last Jedi. Look, I can respect and understand where people's complaints of this film are coming from, but I respectfully but very strongly disagree. In my opinion, this is the best Star Wars film that we got since The Empire Strikes Back. Like Thor Ragnarok before it featured some amazing cinematography and some beautifully shot scenes, which I felt really added to the character stories being told. Overall, I thought this film told some powerful stories that really subverted expectations and stood out as an original piece, where unlike the previous Disney Star Wars films, I felt it felt like I was actually seeing an original new piece of art rather than just retreading things I've seen before. But even considering that, the film did have some amazingly well-timed moments of nostalgia that did solidify this as a Star Wars film with a Star Wars feel, and overall telling a unique action-adventure story that really worked because of these strong character stories, particularly involving the characters of Luke Skywalker, Rey, and Kylo Ren, which were executed amazingly well with some amazing action pieces that completely blew me away. Star Wars The Last Jedi was a truly exceptional film and one of the best of 2017. So now getting to my number 2 favorite movie of the year, and that is Dunkirk. This film was possibly the most stunning cinematic experience I had all year, with a beautifully looking and sounding film, but more than that, was an exceptional war story right up there with classics like Saving Private Ryan. Many had complained that characters in this film didn't feel fleshed out, as their backstories weren't explored at all, but I very strongly disagree, as telling a sweeping character story wasn't the aim of this film, as it was more about documenting a single battle from 3 different perspectives, and it does this amazingly well as it puts you in the mindset of the characters involved and really gives you a feel of what it's like to be on the losing side of this battle. In fact, I'd argue the film is better for not involving unnecessary backstories about girlfriends waiting back home and whatnot, as that would only make it feel like a typical Hollywood movie cliche, whereas the film had a raw sense of realism that really made it a unique piece. In fact, out of the 3 storylines in the film, the one that explored the characters' backstories the most was my least favorite of the 3, as I don't think that's needed, as the film did an amazing job of getting you to care about the characters simply by using the power of the situation itself. And on top of that, I absolutely love the use of non-linear storytelling that was used amazingly well and really enhanced the impact of the story and gave this war film the unique touch of the brilliant director Christopher Nolan, as only he can do. So finally, let me get to my number 1 favorite movie of 2017, and that is War of the Planet of the Apes. This is, in my opinion, by far the best film to come out of the excellent Planet of the Apes prequel trilogy that was much better than it had any business being. This film may have disappointed some with the title about war, which turned out to be more of a slow-paced drama story, telling a character story than an action flick that one might expect when seeing a movie about a bunch of CGI talking apes. However, this film is extremely mature and has a lot of extremely touching moments that brought me to tears, and it was immensely impressive how much the film managed to humanize and get you to empathize with a bunch of CGI apes and root for them to defeat the disgusting humans. Woody Harrelson is amazing in this film as the main antagonist, has with the best of villains is presented as a fully fleshed out and understandable character that you can relate to even though you despise and want to see defeated. War of the Planet of the Apes also features excellence in musical score, cinematography, editing, acting, and of course special effects, telling an extremely impactful and powerful story, even told through its fantastical setting, which is a huge accomplishment, making War of the Planet of the Apes my favorite film of 2017. So that's it for my top 10 movies of 2017. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to do various film top 10s, as well as covering many TV shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.